My name is Renata Calloway. I'm 31 years old, and the night that changed everything, I was sitting on a nursery floor at 2:17 in the morning, watching a tiny screen on my phone, listening to my husband toast to having me committed. I want you to understand what I was wearing when I heard that. Garrett's old Henley shirt, Birkenstocks, my hair falling out of a clip I'd put in 3 days before. Willa was asleep on my chest, 7 weeks old, 5 pounds 11 ounces, the weight of something I would burn the whole world down to protect. And I was looking at the Monitor app, the one I'd installed 3 days earlier over my husband's objections, watching a sliver of hallway I was never supposed to see, hearing a voice I had shared a bed with for 4 years say the words, "She won't see it coming. She trusts me completely." I sat there for 4 minutes without moving. I know because the timestamp was running in the corner of the screen. 9:43 to 9:47 p.m. 4 minutes where everything I thought was real rearranged itself into something I didn't recognize. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand what kind of woman I was before I became the woman on that floor. If you're already leaning in, if something in those first few sentences made your stomach tighten, I want you to hit like before we go any further. Subscribe so you don't miss a single part of this, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I find it helps to know you're out there. Okay, back to the beginning. I grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, the eldest of three. My father worked 60 hours a week at a chemical plant and came home with that specific kind of exhaustion that leaves a person quiet in a way that isn't peaceful. It's just empty. My mother ran the house. She was efficient and capable, and I never once heard her say she was tired. And I think now that's because saying it would have made it real. What I understood early, without anyone telling me, was that the way you proved your worth in our house was by not needing anything. You made yourself easy. You anticipated. You solved problems before they became anyone else's burden. I was 9 years old the first time I fully understood what I was in our family. My mother had some kind of quiet breakdown. Nothing dramatic, nothing that got named or treated, just a Tuesday where she sat down at the kitchen table and couldn't get back up. My father said, "Mom needs rest," and then he looked at me, just looked at me. And I understood that the household was mine now. I packed my brother's lunches for 2 weeks. I signed the permission slips. I made sure the right clothes were clean on the right days. Nobody asked me to. Nobody thanked me afterward. That was just what the capable one did. I internalized that completely. For the next 20 years, I was the person in every room who saw what needed doing and did it without making it anyone else's problem. And here's what I told myself about that. I told myself it was a strength. I told myself I was reliable. I was capable. I was the person people could count on. What I did not let myself think about, not for a long time, was what it costs to be that person. What it costs to be the one who never gets to fall apart, because falling apart isn't available to you. Because you watched your mother do it once, and you watched the way everyone looked at her afterward, and you made a decision in the kitchen of a house in Morgantown, West Virginia, that you would never be looked at that way. If you've ever made yourself the easy one, the capable one, the one who holds everything together while quietly hoping someone will notice, I want you to stay with me. This story is yours too. I put myself through college on a partial scholarship, Pell Grants, and 20 hours a week at the university library. I studied occupational therapy because I'd watched my mother disappear into a role that had no room for what she actually was, and I wanted to spend my professional life helping people reclaim function, reclaim themselves, after something took it away from them. I graduated in 3.5 years to save money on tuition. I moved to Charleston, got licensed, got hired. I built a life that was entirely mine, paid my own rent, drove a used car I'd bought with my own savings, started building a caseload of pediatric patients who, I was told, specifically requested me. Not because I was the warmest therapist, I'm not naturally, but because I was precise. I noticed things. I documented everything. My supervisor used to say, "Renata, you see the thing behind the thing." I took that as the highest possible compliment. I met Garrett when I was 26 at a backyard cookout. He was 30, broad-shouldered, funny in that easy crowd-working way I'd never been able to do. He made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, like someone had chosen me specifically, not because I was useful, but because I was wanted. I know how that sounds now. I know exactly how that sounds. But I want you to understand what that feeling was worth to a woman who had spent 26 years making herself small enough to fit wherever she was needed. Being chosen felt like coming up for air. We got married when I was 28. Small ceremony, both our families there. His mother Dolores wore ivory, not quite white, but close enough that I noticed and told myself I was being paranoid. She hugged me at the reception and said, "You're exactly what Garrett needs." I thought it was a compliment. I think about those words constantly now. The first 2 years were good. Not perfect. There were small frictions, moments where I felt something shift and then shift back, like a door that doesn't quite hang straight. Garrett didn't love that I had friends from work I'd see on Friday evenings. Not in a dramatic way. He'd never forbid anything. But there would be this quiet withdrawal, this temperature drop when I got home, and I'd find myself canceling more often than not just to avoid the cold. My closest colleague, Priya, noticed before I did. She said once, over lunch, "How often do you actually do what you want to do?" I laughed and changed the subject. When I got pregnant, something shifted in Garrett, and not in the direction I'd hoped. He became more attentive, which sounds good and in the beginning felt good, but it was the particular attentiveness of someone who is managing something. When I mentioned I was tired, it was noted. When I was emotional, and I was pregnant, I was allowed to be emotional. It was filed away somehow. I could feel it being filed. I told Priya this once on a walk, and she stopped walking and looked at me and said, "Renata, what does that mean, filed away?" And I couldn't explain it. I just said, "He remembers it differently than I do." Willa was born on a Thursday morning in October. She was healthy. She was perfect. I cried in a way I had never cried before. Not from sadness, but from something I didn't have a name for. Some enormous foundational thing shifting into place. I looked at this person I had made and I thought, I will never let anything happen to you. I will see every threat before it has a name. I didn't know yet that the threat was already in the room. In the weeks after Willa came home, Garrett's mother started visiting more often, 4 times a week. Always when Garrett was home, always staying longer than made sense, always making comments that floated in the register between concern and accusation. "You seem overwhelmed, sweetheart. Some women struggle more than others. There's no shame in it. I read that it's important to get a professional opinion early." She'd say these things while holding my daughter, which I noticed but told myself I was misreading. And Garrett started echoing her. Gently, always gently. "Are you sure you're sleeping? You seemed confused earlier. I'm just worried about you." The word worried started appearing in every other sentence out of his mouth, and it took me 11 days to realize that the more worried he said he was, the more wrong I felt. Not sad, not overwhelmed, wrong. Like I was failing a test I hadn't known I was taking. On day 11, I started writing things down. I didn't call it evidence. I called it a list. A record of what had actually been said, what had actually happened, what the timestamp actually showed. Because I am an occupational therapist, and I have been documenting observable behavior my entire professional life, and something in me, something below conscious thought, recognized the pattern before my rational mind would let me name it. 3 days later, I ordered the baby monitor with the camera. Not because I suspected anything specific, because I was a woman who had always trusted what she could see over what she was being told, and something Some old early warning system built in a house in Morgantown when I was 9 years old was going off. I set it up in the nursery at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Garrett said it was unnecessary. I said, I know, I want it anyway. And I pointed the wide-angle lens at the door. The thing about being gaslit, and I'm going to use that word because it is the correct word, even though it took me a long time to let myself use it, is that it doesn't feel like someone is lying to you. It feels like you are losing your grip on something you used to hold easily. Like your hands have gotten weaker without you noticing, and everything you try to pick up keeps slipping. And the person standing next to you keeps saying, "See, you can't manage it. Let me help." And you start to believe them. Not because you're foolish, because you're exhausted. Because you've been awake every 3 hours for 7 weeks. Because the person saying it shares your bed and your bank account and your daughter's last name. And the alternative of believing he is doing this on purpose, is so enormous and so terrible that your mind keeps choosing the smaller, kinder explanation. I want to be honest about how close I came to choosing that explanation permanently. There was a Thursday, Willa was about 5 weeks old, where Garrett came home from work and found me crying on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, just sitting there, back against the cabinet, Willa and her bouncer 2 feet away, both of us completely fine, but me crying in that boneless way where there's no specific reason. It's just everything at once. He sat down next to me and he held me and he said, "I've got you. I've always got you." And I believed him completely. In that moment, I believed him the way you believe in gravity, not as a choice, but as a fact of the physical world. That same evening, after I'd put Willa down, I heard him on the phone in the garage. I wasn't eavesdropping, the door wasn't fully closed, and I was walking past. I heard him say, "She was on the floor again today. I've been keeping notes like Marcus suggested." And then a pause. And then, I know she's not going to do it voluntarily. I stood in the hallway for a long time. I told myself I hadn't heard what I'd heard. I went to bed. I didn't write it on the list. That's the part I come back to. That one night where I almost stopped documenting, where I almost talked myself out of the evidence I'd already collected. And I think about every woman who has ever gotten to that exact place and stepped back from it, who chose the smaller, kinder explanation and handed the next years of her life to it. And I feel something that isn't quite grief, but lives right next to it. I want to ask you something right now, and I mean this genuinely. I'm not moving on until you sit with it for a second. Has someone you trusted ever used your most vulnerable moment, the realest, most unguarded version of you, as data? As something to be filed, recorded, reported to someone else? Because that's what was happening on that kitchen floor. The moment I thought was the most human, the most connected thing we'd done in months, he was cataloging it. Drop that in the comments. I read every single one. Because I think a lot of you know exactly what I'm talking about, and I think you deserve to say it out loud. The monitor footage came 4 days after that hallway moment, and I've already told you what I heard. But I want to tell you what happened in the minutes after, because the minutes after are the whole story in miniature. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I sat on the nursery floor for 4 minutes with Willa on my chest and a phone in my hand, and I didn't make a single sound. What I felt was not panic. What I felt was a terrible, clarifying quiet, the way the air gets in the seconds after a very loud noise, when the world is recalibrating. And underneath that quiet, something I recognized. The same thing I had felt when I was 9 years old, and my father looked at me in the kitchen, and I understood without words that I was the only one who was going to do what needed doing. I sent Priya a text that said, "I need you to come over, tonight. Don't call first." She texted back in 40 seconds, "On my way." That is who Priya Nantucket is. I want to tell you who she is, because she matters to this story the way a load-bearing wall matters to a house. invisibly, until everything else shifts and suddenly you understand what was holding it up. I met Priya on my first week at the clinic, 6 years ago. She was the senior therapist, 7 years ahead of me, and she had the specific quality of someone who has already made every mistake worth making and extracted every lesson from it. She had left a 7-year relationship at 33, walked out of an apartment, a shared life, a whole version of herself. And she talked about it the way someone talks about a surgery, something that was necessary and painful and resulted in a person who worked better. She was the first colleague I'd ever had who, when I said I was fine, looked at me and said, "I know. What's the actual answer?" She arrived at my door at 12:30 a.m. in a rust-colored sweater with her clinic ID badge still clipped to the collar. She had gotten dressed in under 3 minutes. She did not ask if I was okay. She said, "Show me." I showed her the footage. She watched it once, completely still, her hands around a mug of tea I had made her automatically because making tea was something I could do with my body while my mind was somewhere else. Then she looked at me and said, "How long have you been keeping notes?" I went to the bedroom and came back with the notebook. 11 pages, small handwriting, dates and times in the margin. She read it without speaking. I watched her face as she read, and I watched the thing she was trying not to show me, which was that she was scared. Not for herself, for me, and for Willa. When she finished, she set the notebook down very carefully on the table, the way you set down something that matters. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly." I said, "Okay." She said, "This is what coercive control looks like. I know because I lived in it for 4 years, and I didn't have a notebook." I nodded, not because I was calm, but because some part of me had known this was the word for it, for longer than I was willing to admit. And hearing her say it out loud didn't break something. It named something that was already broken. We stayed at that table until 3 a.m. She made more tea. I fed Willa twice. We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about facts. What I had. What I could document. What the legal options were. This is what I mean when I say Priya is who she is. Another person would have held my hand and cried with me. Priya held my evidence and helped me figure out what to do with it. She also told me something I hadn't known. She said, "Check the bank account. Not just the recent transactions. Go back 4 months." I pulled up the app on my phone right there at the table. What I found was not the 3 transactions I'd already flagged. What I found was 11. 11 withdrawals over 4 months, ranging from $800 to $4,200, all coded to business expense categories Garrett managed. Total, just over $22,000. From a joint account where my paycheck had been deposited faithfully for 3 years, and that I had not accessed since going on unpaid leave 6 weeks earlier because I was trying to be conservative. I sat with that number for a moment. $22,000. Moved in increments small enough not to trigger any automatic alert. Moved with the patience of someone who had been planning this for a while. Priya watched me process it. She said nothing. I picked up my pen and I added it to the list. Then I opened my email, because Priya had said, "Check everything, not just the account." And I searched Garrett's name in the sent folder of the shared household account we both had access to and almost never used. There were 3 emails I hadn't seen. The most recent was a forwarded thread sent to an address I didn't recognize, with a subject line that read, "Draft Observations, RC, updated." My initials. I opened it. It was written in clinical language, detached, precise, the specific vocabulary of a psychiatric assessment. It described a woman who had been observed to be disoriented upon waking, emotionally dysregulated, unable to provide consistent care for her infant, resistant to professional support despite multiple interventions by family members. There was a name at the bottom of the draft, Marcus Hale, MD. I looked at Priya. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "He's been building a file on you. Not to help me, not because he was worried, to use it, to hand it to a psychiatrist with a surrendered license and a debt to the Whitmore family, and a willingness to write whatever the document needed to say, so that a judge somewhere would look at a paper signed by a doctor and a concerned husband and an attentive mother-in-law and decide that Renata Calloway was unfit. Unfit to care for her daughter, unfit to manage her own affairs, unfit to stand in the way of a financial reorganization that had been in motion for months before Willa was even born. I sat with that understanding for exactly as long as it took me to finish my tea. Then I said, I need an attorney. First thing tomorrow morning. Priya said, I already have a name. I have spent a lot of my professional life helping people prepare for difficult things. I work with children who have to relearn how to use their hands, their legs, the ordinary machinery of their bodies after something took it away. And the thing I have learned, the thing that is true every single time, is that preparation is not the absence of fear. Preparation is what you do with your hands while the fear is happening. You don't wait for it to pass. You work inside it. That is how I spent the 12 hours between 3 a.m. and the moment I called Sasha Trent's office. After Priya fell asleep on the couch, she had refused to leave, just kicked off her shoes and folded herself onto the cushions like it was the most natural thing in the world. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook, and I added everything I had found in the email account. I wrote the name Marcus Hale at the top of a clean page, and underneath it, I wrote what I knew. Surrendered license, contract assessments, connection to the Whitmore family, draft document with my initials. Then I opened a separate browser and spent 40 minutes building a picture of who he was. A psychiatric practice in Morgantown closed in 2021 following a licensing board complaint. 3 public records. 2 court appearances as an expert witness, both for the same family law firm. A firm that had, I discovered in the last search before the sun came up, a senior partner whose name appeared in the same professional directory as Dolores Whitmore's estate attorney. After Priya fell asleep on the couch, she had refused to leave, just kicked off her shoes and folded herself onto the cushions like it was the most natural thing in the world. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook, and I added everything I had found in the email account. I wrote the name Marcus Hale at the top of a clean page, and underneath it I wrote what I knew. Surrendered license, contract assessments, connection to the Whitmore family, draft document with my initials. Then I opened a separate browser and spent 40 minutes building a picture of who he was. A psychiatric practice in Morgantown, closed in 2021 following a licensing board complaint. 3 public records. 2 court appearances as an expert witness, both for the same family law firm. A firm that had, I discovered in the last search before the sun came up, a senior partner whose name appeared in the same professional directory as Dolores Whitmore's estate attorney. I wrote all of it down. Dates, case numbers, names. I wrote the way I write clinical notes, without editorializing, without emotion, just the observable facts in sequence. By the time I closed the notebook, I had 14 pages. I looked at those 14 pages in the early morning light, and I felt something I want to describe accurately, because I think it matters. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't triumph. It was closer to the feeling of walking into a room you've been told is empty, and turning on the light and seeing exactly what you knew was there. A kind of terrible vindication, the proof that your perception was correct all along, and the grief of knowing you needed the proof. Priya woke up at 7:15. I had made coffee and fed Willa and changed her and gotten myself dressed. Real clothes, not the Henley. A gray merino pullover and jeans. My hair actually brushed and down. Priya looked at me and looked at the table and said, "You didn't sleep." I said, "No." She said, "Good, neither would I." At 8 a.m., she called Sasha Trent. I want to tell you who Sasha is, because she matters. Priya had used her 3 years earlier in a situation involving a colleague and a wrongful termination, and what she said about her was this: she's the kind of person who reads a document the way a surgeon reads a scan. She doesn't miss things. Sasha's office was on the east side of Charleston, second floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and good coffee, and she had been practicing family law for 19 years. She was 54 years old, small and precise, with reading glasses she took on and off continuously, and a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being measured for usefulness. We were in her office by 9:15. I put the notebook on her desk. I put the bank statements beside it. I put the printed email thread with the draft psychiatric assessment beside that. And then I put my phone on the desk, and I played her 47 seconds of audio from the baby monitor. She listened to all of it without writing anything down. Then she put her glasses on and picked up the notebook and read for 19 minutes. I know because there was a clock on the wall behind her. And I watched it the way you watch things when you are trying to stay in your body and not float away from the situation. When she finished, she set the notebook down with the same careful deliberateness that Priya had, and she looked at me and said, "We're going to file for emergency protective order and asset freeze today." Then she paused and she said something I have carried with me every day since. She said, "You did exactly the right things. You just didn't know you were doing them." I didn't cry in her office. I waited until we were in the elevator, and then I turned to Priya and I put my forehead against her shoulder for about 4 seconds. And then the elevator opened and I straightened up and we walked out into the morning. That is the moment, the one I keep returning to. Not the confrontation, not the legal victory, not the moment the papers were served. That 4 seconds in the elevator, forehead on a friend's shoulder, knowing for the first time in months that my perception of reality was my own, and it was correct, and I was not losing my mind. I was documenting a crime. If that landed somewhere in you, if you know that feeling of finally being told you were right when you had almost stopped believing you were, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't. It's a small thing, but it means more to me than I can explain in a YouTube script. Sasha filed at 11:47 a.m. The emergency asset freeze covered the joint account, the 3 marital property holdings Garrett had listed in his financial disclosure when we married, and, because Sasha had moved quickly and precisely, the holding account in Dolores's name, where $340,000 in transferred assets had landed over the preceding 4 months. This last part, Sasha told me later, had required a second filing and a phone call to a judge she had worked with for a decade. She made both happen between 10 a.m. and noon. Garrett was served at his office at 3:11 p.m. I know this because Priya was with me at her house when the process server's confirmation came through on Sasha's portal. And I watched the timestamp, and I thought about his timestamp. 9:43 to 9:47 p.m. on a Monday evening. 4 minutes of him thinking he was invisible. 4 minutes that were, it turned out, the most documented 4 minutes of his life. I did not feel triumphant when the confirmation came through. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a different reaction. What I felt was something quieter and heavier. Because the man being served papers at a commercial property management office in Charleston, West Virginia, was also the man who had held me on a kitchen floor 5 weeks earlier and said, "I've got you." And the fact that both of those things were true, that both of those men existed inside the same person, was not something I could resolve with a legal filing. It just sat there, unresolved, the way some things do. Dolores called Garrett from her car in the parking lot of a Kroger in Beckley at 3:34 p.m. I know this because Sasha's office received a call from Dolores's attorney at 3:51 p.m. The attorney's first question was whether there was room for negotiation. Sasha's answer was one sentence. "My client's position is fully documented." Marcus Hale received a letter from Sasha's office at 4 p.m., informing him that the draft psychiatric assessment bearing his name had been entered into legal proceedings, and that any further documentation produced by him in connection with this matter would be subject to evidentiary scrutiny. He did not respond. He did not produce any further documentation. The thing about watching a plan collapse is that it doesn't make a sound. There is no crash, no dramatic undoing. There is just a series of phone calls that don't go the way someone planned, a series of doors that turn out to be locked, a silence where there was supposed to be forward motion. That is what happened to Garrett and Dolores on the afternoon of a Wednesday in November. Not a crash, just a silence. I sat on Priya's couch that evening with Willa asleep in the portable bassinet beside me, and I tried to locate what I felt. I went through the obvious ones: anger, relief, grief, vindication. They were all there, but none of them was the main thing. The main thing was underneath all of them, quieter and stranger. It was the feeling of being returned to myself, of being handed back something I had not known was being taken until it was gone. Priya made dinner, something with pasta and a lot of garlic, the kind of meal that is about warmth rather than nutrition. We ate at her kitchen table, and one of her dogs put his head on my knee, and I let him. We didn't talk about Garrett or Dolores or Sasha or legal proceedings. We talked about a patient of mine I'd been thinking about, a 6-year-old boy who had been relearning how to grip a pencil after a nerve injury, and how last session, before my leave, he had finally written his own name. Priya said, "That's the whole job right there." I said, "Yeah, that's the whole job." That night, after Priya had gone to bed and the house was quiet and Willa was fed and asleep, I sat alone at that kitchen table and I thought about Dolores. Not with anger, with something more complicated. I thought about a woman who had married young and managed her entire life upward, and built her identity around a son who needed her to be necessary. I thought about what it must feel like to watch your son build a life that doesn't require you. I thought about how fear, in some people, curdles into something that wears the costume of love until you can't tell them apart anymore. I didn't forgive her that night. I'm not sure I have, even now. But I saw her, and seeing the human thing inside the terrible thing, that's what made me able to leave without needing the last word. The consequences came the way consequences usually do when someone has been building a deception on borrowed time. Not all at once, but in a sequence of small collapses, each one quieter than the last. Sasha called me 10 days after the filing to tell me that Garrett's attorney had made a second attempt at negotiation, and that Dolores's attorney had withdrawn from the asset dispute entirely. The $340,000 in the holding account was frozen, pending the divorce proceedings. The 3 marital property holdings were under court protection. The joint bank account had been restructured under my name as primary holder by court order. Garrett had moved into his mother's house in Beckley. He had not attempted to contact me directly since the papers were served, which Sasha said was either the advice of his attorney or the behavior of someone who understood, finally, that there was nothing left to manage. I learned most of the rest of it through Priya, who had a colleague at the clinic whose husband worked in commercial real estate in the same professional circle as Garrett. In a city like Charleston, in a world as small as regional property management, things surface. What surfaced was this. Garrett had been carrying $80,000 in private debt that nobody in our marriage had known about. The remnant of a business collapse he'd never told me the full extent of. The Whitmore & Associates firm, which Dolores technically owned and Garrett nominally ran, had been operating at a loss for 2 years. The asset transfer to Dolores's account, the $340,000, had not been a spontaneous act of financial maneuvering. It had been the last move in a plan that had been in motion, Sasha estimated, for at least 8 months before Willa was born. 8 months. Willa was 7 weeks old when I found the footage, which means someone had been planning this while I was pregnant, while I was building a nursery and choosing a name and reading about infant sleep schedules and believing, with my whole unguarded heart, that we were building something together. I sat with that for a long time. I'm still sitting with it, in some ways. Not because it breaks me, it doesn't anymore, but because it is the kind of knowledge that changes the shape of the past. You look back at specific moments and you understand them differently. The conversation where Garrett suggested we put the house in his name for tax purposes. The evening he mentioned, casually, that his mother would make an excellent emergency guardian for Willa if anything ever happened to us. The way he started referring to my job in the past tense, so gently I almost didn't notice. When you were working instead of when you go back. I noticed now. I noticed all of it, retroactively, in the particular excruciating way that hindsight works. And then I made a decision that I think was the right one. I wrote it all down, added it to the notebook, handed it to Sasha, and then I closed the notebook and I did not open it again. Because there is a version of recovery that is just extended prosecution, where you keep building the case long after the verdict is in, because the case is the only way you know how to hold the pain. I had seen that version in people I loved, and I did not want it. I went back to work on a Tuesday in February. Willa was 4 months old by then, round-faced and grabby, and deeply suspicious of anyone who wasn't me or Priya, which I took as evidence of excellent judgment. I had arranged care through the clinic's child care network. A woman named Gloria who watched 3 other children in a house 12 minutes from the clinic, and who, on my first day back, sent me a photo of Willa asleep in a bouncer with a burp cloth on her head like a little hat, captioned, "She put it there herself. I have no idea how." I walked back into the clinic and Priya was standing at the front desk, and she handed me a coffee and said, "Welcome back. Your 9 a.m. is already in room 3, and he wants to show you something." No ceremony. No acknowledgement of the 4 months that had passed. Just the next thing, waiting. I have never loved her more than I did in that moment. My 9 a.m. was a 7-year-old named Derek, who had been relearning fine motor function after a wrist fracture, and what he wanted to show me was that he could now tie his own shoes. He demonstrated 3 times. The third time he looked up at me with the specific pride of someone who has worked very hard for a thing that most people take for granted, and said, "I practiced every single day." I said, "I know you did. I can tell." And I meant both sentences in more than one direction. 2 people came back to me in the months that followed, not from Garrett's world, from mine. The first was a friend named Cassidy I had drifted from over the 3 years of my marriage, a woman I'd met in graduate school who sent me a text that said only, "I've been thinking about you. Can I call?" We talked for 2 hours. She said, "I watched you get smaller, and I didn't say anything, and I'm sorry." I told her she didn't need to apologize. She said, "I know I don't need to. I want to." That distinction mattered. That is what real acknowledgement sounds like. Not the performance of sorry, but the specific naming of the specific thing, offered without expectation of immediate absolution. The second was my mother. She called on a Sunday evening, which was unusual. She was a Tuesday caller, habitual and reliable as a utility bill. She said, "I heard some of what happened. I don't know all of it." I said, "No." She said, "I want to." And there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before, or maybe had never let myself hear, which was the sound of a woman who had spent 30 years being the capable one in her own house, and who recognized, in her daughter's story, the particular architecture of that trap. We talked for an hour and a half. At the end, she said, "I should have shown you that it was okay to need things." I said, "You were doing what you knew how to do." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So were you." That's the part that breaks my heart. I didn't write a letter to Garrett. I had thought about it, in the way you think about things you ultimately decide not to do, turning them over, examining them, setting them back down. What I had to say to him, I had already said in 14 pages of documented evidence, and a legal filing that cost him $340,000, and a marriage, and a plan he'd spent the better part of a year constructing. The statement had been made. It didn't need a postscript. What I did write was something different. It was a note to myself, 1 page, written on the same kind of plain notebook paper as the inventory. Not for any legal purpose, not for anyone else to read. It said this: "You were not imagining it. You were not too sensitive, too anxious, too much. You were a woman in a situation that required exactly the skills you had spent your whole life building, and you used them. The thing that was supposed to be your weakness, the way you document, the way you notice, the way you trust evidence over reassurance, was the thing that saved you. You didn't win in spite of who you are. You won because of it. I read it to Priya on the phone that evening. There was a pause on her end. Then she said, "That's the one. That's the whole thing." And I knew she was right. I am 31 years old. I live in a rented house on the east side of Charleston with 2 rooms and a small yard where I have started, improbably, growing tomatoes. Willa is 6 months old now and has strong opinions about music and a laugh that sounds like someone spilling a bag of coins. Every morning I make coffee and I sit at the kitchen table while she watches the world from her bouncer with those enormous, considering eyes, and I think, this is the life. Not the life I planned, the life I'm in. And I would not trade a single documented, time-stamped, hard-won moment of it. The baby monitor is still in the nursery. I don't need it for the same reasons I needed it then, but I haven't taken it down. Sometimes at night, when Willa is asleep, I open the app just to look at her. Just to see, with my own eyes, that she is exactly where I put her, exactly as safe as I know her to be. The camera doesn't lie. It never did. My name is Renata Calloway. I'm 31 years old, and I finally know what it feels like to trust my own eyes completely. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I mean it as a real question, not a script line. Has someone ever tried to make you doubt your own perception, your own memory, your own version of events? Has anyone ever been so committed to a different story that you started to wonder if they were right? Leave it in the comments. Not because I want you to relive anything painful, but because I think there are people watching this right now who have never said that out loud to anyone, and saying it, even in a comment, even to strangers, is the first small step toward trusting yourself again. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, hit like, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and share it with someone who needs to hear that being the person who notices things, who documents things, who trusts what they can actually see, that is not a weakness. That has never been a weakness. I'll see you in the next one.